Greetings listeners and welcome to Paranormal Frequencies. If you're looking for ghost stories and tales of the paranormal in general, then you're in the right place. The channel's goal is to bring you the best there is to hear in terms of spooky tales on what I hope to be a regular basis. My intention is to focus the channel on people's stories and experiences rather than the more well-known paranormal stories out there. Having said that, I will dedicate some episodes to famous paranormal cases from time to time. The show will be quite audio heavy rather than visual as I share people's experiences. However, I will throw in some dark imagery for those of you watching. And without further ado, let's kick off the channel with our first episode. Today's story comes in from a former student here in the UK. Episode 1. Peace. It's been many years since I've told this story, but I think now would be a good time. It's unbelievable, I know, but please, hear me out. I don't ask that you simply believe me, but simply that you listen to what I have to say. My story starts back in the 1990s, back at university to be precise. I was living in dormitories at the time. There was myself and John who shared a room, and we were friends with two girls called Kate and Kristin. John was very much a couple with Kate, but I was just simply friends with Kristin at the time. For all of us, this had been our first time living away from home. It was a sense of freedom, and it was an absolutely unbelievable time within our lives. All of us were fairly decent students, although we did like to enjoy ourselves as well, just as any student would. Anyway, our story really begins at the end of term, December in fact. It's one of those odd times on campus really. Most students will go home for Christmas and the New Year, leaving the dorm rooms fairly empty and echoey. My residential block was made in the 1930s. It was slightly creaky in places, it had a few dark corners, but overall it wasn't a scary place to live, because most of the time it was packed full of students doing studenty things. As I seem to remember, there were very few of us left in my block at the end of term. It was myself and John living together, and we would often invite Kate and Kristin over at this time. I remember this day particularly well. I myself was a history student. I'm the type that's probably slightly nerdy. I like my own space, and I like neat and tidiness. It's pretty much a definition of my character. John, on the other hand, was an art student, and let's just say he was a creative through and through. I'd quite often come back to our room to find it in not such a great condition. Not dirty per se, but just messy. He had his art supplies, spare clothes hanging over the back of chairs, and just generally it tended to spill into my part of the room. To be honest, if John wasn't such a nice guy, it would have bothered me more, but as it were, we were the best of friends. However, that never stopped me on a regular basis from me telling him to pick up his mess, especially when the girls were coming over. So there we were, right at the end of term, and we had a little bit of time to kill. By this time, it was only myself and John in the entire building. It wasn't a huge building, but all the same, just us two rattling round in the cold weather. Yeah, it was slightly isolating. But there we were, it was the night before we were to all drive home to our respective homes for the holidays. Kate and Kristin lived off-site together, so we invited them over one night for a bit of fun and games. We'd had a few snacks, a few beers, but nothing to get us drunk, just a light-hearted evening really. It was then that John pulled out a spirit board. We'd obviously been tidying up earlier in the day, and I think it had just been left on one side. He didn't push the issue, but he said, "Hey, do you think we should probably give it a go, just something to do for the evening?" I seem to remember that the board had been hanging around since Halloween, where we were too busy to actually get round to using it. Kristin was very happy to give it a try. She was always up for anything, really. I myself was a bit indifferent. I definitely didn't believe in ghosts or spooks, and, well, it was just a form of entertainment to me. Not for one moment did I think anything would actually happen of any consequence. Out of the four of us, Kate was the only one with any apprehension. I seem to remember she'd had a much more Christian upbringing than most of us, and she seemed genuinely nervous. Kristin was very positive though, and she really tried to involve her in the evening. And John, well, John was John, he was the fun-loving soul of the party. He really actually was the one that convinced Kate that she should join in. Eventually, everyone was on board, including Kate. Now, our residential block perhaps had around 30 rooms, and remember, there's now only the 4 of us walking around, and it was getting rather late. Rather than stay in mine and John's cramped room, we decided to look for somewhere a little more appropriate. So we actually settled on the kitchen downstairs. The kitchen was more of a kitchen/dining room. It was now empty obviously, and it was made up of a few dining tables, but it was mostly bare. It was very functional as a room, I seem to remember. We set up the board on the middle table, and just for ambience we turned off all the lights in the entire block, and the only light available now was candlelight that we had set up around the kitchen. Now, as I've stated, I was very sceptical, and I was very much not a believer in ghosts or the paranormal or anything else for that matter. Did the darkness and the candlelight make it creepy? Yeah, sure, but that's absolutely normal. Would I have jumped had someone jumped out on me and screamed? Of course, but that's just human nature. So I sat there in the darkened room with Kristin, Kate and John. Each of us put our fingers on the planchette, and we waited. And we waited. It got to the point where I actually asked John what was actually supposed to happen. We'd asked the spirits, is anyone there, and nothing. It was all a bit of a letdown. In my mind it was predictable, but a letdown all the same. I really did actually want to see something, even if it was fake. John seemed very calm and confident though, and he said, "Look, just wait. Something will happen. It just takes time to manifest." So we sat there in the darkness, waiting some more, before... Yes, could it be that the planchette did actually move slightly? Again, my first reaction wasn't, oh, it's a ghost. My reaction was, oh, somebody did that, either by accident or, involuntary, or even John having a bit of a laugh. The others seemed a lot more convinced though, and it was John that took up the lead and said, "Are you there? Can you confirm your name?" Slowly but surely, the planchette did 100% move, and it spelled out the name D-A-V-E, Dave. It was at this point I openly laughed. Honestly, a spirit called Dave, you just couldn't make this up. I seem to remember Kate kind of hushing me up. It was clear that she was taking this very seriously. John continued though, and he asked more questions. I can honestly say I forget now what they were, but it was all the usual, how old are you? Where are you? Are you in the room now? From what I remember, Dave had been a student in our residential block, and he had died sometime before his final exams. I don't think there was any more detail or explanation around it, simply that he'd stayed on. By this point, Kristin, who was very much the fun-loving one of the group, she seemed a little concerned that we were getting results, and kept asking who was moving it. Now, I know it wasn't me, and I very much doubt it was Kate, so this really only left John, and that would have been very much in line with his character. John absolutely assured us that it wasn't him though, and he even said, "Look, I'll take my fingers off the planchette, and you can try again, but one of you has to ask the questions this time." So John took his fingers off the planchette and sat there quietly, trying not to influence the group. It was at this point that Kristin said to Kate, "Okay, you ask a question." Now, I really didn't think anything would happen. I knew it wasn't me, I was certain it wasn't Kate, so that only left Kristin. Sure enough though, the planchette did start to move, and I could tell by the reaction on Kristin's face that it wasn't her. It was clear by this point that Kate wanted to keep the situation light-hearted, so she asked the simple question, "What will I get for a Christmas present this year?" We all watched and watched. Slowly but surely, the planchette began to move once more. It spelled out P-E-A-C-E. Peace. So at this point I was in two minds. It definitely wasn't John moving this, and I still didn't think it was Kate or Kristin, but it certainly wasn't me, so I was left a little perplexed. But having thought about it after, it would have made complete sense that it was Kristin moving the planchet. After all, she would have also observed that Kate was nervous. Having the message of peace for Christmas, well, that would be quite a nice thing. With the group now convinced that John was not involved in moving the planchet, he was allowed to rejoin. And he seemed very impressed with the results. Having mixed opinions on what I'd just witnessed, I wanted to test this out myself, so I asked the same question. What will I get for a Christmas present this year? The board took a couple of seconds, but surely but slowly, it spelled out the word S-P-A-C-E, space. It was at this point that I saw John give a little wry smile. I think he found that the idea of having space for Christmas, that would have been, quite a nice thing for me. So these messages were definitely coming from someone around the table, or at least someone that knew us. Past this last message, there was not much of consequence. I seem to remember we played for a few more minutes, but it was mostly gibberish that the board was producing at this point. Slowly, we said goodbye and took our hands off of the planchet. As we did so though, there were 3 deafening bangs from somewhere within the residential block. The blood ran cold in each of us. Now, this was not an imagined noise, this was 3 distinct, loud bangs. And this coincided exactly when we finished the game. I have to say that each of us was very startled by these noises. They were indeed very loud. I have to say that we were indeed very startled at this point. The noises couldn't have been more than a couple of rooms away at the most. Now remember, this was late at night and the other students we knew had gone home. I think it was perhaps myself and John that jumped up first and of course turned on the lights as you would do in this type of situation, before going out into the hallway to look. We looked in the rooms on the ground floor near the kitchen. There was nothing, they were still in darkness just as we'd left them. The hallway also was dark, and the front door was securely locked via a key. We proceeded to go upstairs to check each floor, and sure enough all of the lights were still off, nothing had been disturbed. We never did find the source of the banging, however all we could do was chalk it up to being something outside. We did look out of the windows at the time, but we didn't see anything. After the eventful evening, I went back to the room with John, whilst Kate drove Kristin home. Before going to bed, I did question John. Was it him that moved the planchet, or made any of these noises? And he absolutely assured me it wasn't him. Although John was a bit of a joker at times, he was at least an honest person. I do believe him when he said that it wasn't him. The next morning was a typical December winter's day. It had been frosty overnight and it was clear that there was some snow starting to fall. It was definitely best to get away early if you could. Kristin had travelled back to her home via public transport early in the day. She didn't actually live too far, just 2 towns over from the university. I had left early that morning to avoid the worst of the snow. However, John had to wait just a little longer as he needed a ride from Kate. They were both going to go home to her place for the holidays and meet her parents for the first time. I made it home with very little event and was keen to have a hot coffee once I got in. It had after all been a long journey. It seemed very peaceful being at home for Christmas with my parents. It had been a long term and lots of exams had really worn me down. The comfort and familiarity of my parents' house just seemed right. That was until the phone started ringing. Now remember, this wasn't a mobile phone, this was a landline as we had back in the day. It was my father that picked up the phone, this being his house and all, but it was very clear that the phone call was for me. My father handed me the phone, explaining that it was the police that wanted to speak to me. I was very much a person on the straight and narrow, and being told that the police are on the line for you, well, it gives you that certain jolt of fear, even though you know you haven't done anything wrong. But something had indeed gone very wrong. The authoritative voice at the end of the phone informed me that Kate and John had been involved in a serious accident and had lost their lives. I was stunned. The only thing I could ask was how. The police officer replied that there'd been a 3-car collision on the motorway. There had been some kind of slippage on the ice, and it was almost instant death for most of the drivers. I can honestly say that I don't remember our conversation in full. However, I do remember him asking me was there anyone else that needed to be informed. I took it upon myself to inform Kristin. I knew she would be devastated at Kate's death. Just days before Christmas, we held a service for our 2 friends. It was a sombre occasion, but I managed to say a few words to the congregation. What was sickening, though, was when they lowered their bodies into the ground. The gravestones simply read, "In peace." I think myself and Kristin made the association at the same time. Could it be that our evening with the spirit board had in some way been linked to their deaths? That message on the gravestone, it played on my mind for days. Had this been the gift from the board? It was a few days later, and the holidays had passed. It was now the start of the new year and a new term, and I returned to the room I had shared with John. Over the Christmas break, the university staff had helped remove his items to save us from the stress. As I sat on his bed in the empty room, it occurred to me. I had so much space. If you enjoyed this week's paranormal story, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel for more tales of the supernatural and the unexplained. Also, I'd like to hear in the comments if you have had a paranormal experience of your own. As the channel progresses, I hope to actively include stories from the listeners of the channel. Until next time, my friends, happy hauntings.